Okay, cool. I don't want to take you on the wrong tour. Just so you are prepared, we're going to cover a lot of ground on this tour. We're going to go all the way up to the bridge of the ship, all the way down to the engine rooms, and so we do a lot of steps. We're going to do a lot of walking, but we get to see some really cool areas of the ship that way. Another benefit of that is while we're going to be focused on the engineering of the ship on this tour, both Tim, this is Tim by the way, he's my shipmate here, and myself know about other aspects of the Queen Mary as well, so please feel free to ask questions or have us try to fill out any parts you might be curious about. And of course the travel time between those spots gives us a good chance to do those things. We are going to start off by heading up to the bridge of the ship. We're going to head to the wheelhouse, so just follow me this way.
Going to the bridge.
Welcome to the bridge. All right, so welcome to the bridge or the wheelhouse of the ship. This is like the command center, the nerve center. This is where the officers and the captain, of course, would be delivering orders to the rest of the crew, and this is where they would pilot the ship. I'm going to go into detail about all that as this is the engineering tour, but let me start off just by giving you a brief history of the Queen Mary. Some of you may have had the opportunity to take historic tours, and some may not. So I just want to give us a little basic context for that. The Queen Mary and her sister ship, the Queen Elizabeth, were designed back in 1926. These ships were designed to be the largest and fastest ocean liners ever built. The Queen Mary makes her maiden voyage on May 27th, 1936. She would travel out of Southampton, England, stop in Cherbourg, France, and then steam across the Atlantic to New York. And she was designed really to carry the wealthiest passengers on Earth. You would find royalty, billionaires, politicians, movie stars, all traveling aboard the Queen Mary. She serves in this very exclusive way up until the start of the Second World War. And then they were fitting as many people aboard as humanly possible because the Queen Mary was drafted into service as a troop transport ship. The Queen Mary proved to be incredibly valuable to the Allied war effort. First off, because of the size of the ship, they could fit thousands aboard at one time. The Queen Mary would typically carry around 3,200 people per voyage when she was an ocean liner. That's passengers and crew combined. But of course, during the war, she was carrying many more people than that. And in fact, on one of the Queen Mary's wartime voyages, she set the record for the most people ever transported aboard a single naval vessel in one crossing when she carried 16,683 servicemen on one voyage. There were so many people aboard, we are told that the ship actually sat 4 feet lower in the water just from the weight of all the human beings aboard. So she could carry many people because of her size. Because of the Queen Mary's incredible speed, she could transport those service people safely. Adolf Hitler wanted to sink the Queen Mary so desperately that in 1942 he offered a $250,000 bounty to any captain who could sink the Queen Mary. You're standing on the ship right now, so I think you can probably put together, they never got her. In fact, she never even came under attack because she was so fast they simply could not get within range. By the time the war is over, Winston Churchill estimates that the Second World War was shortened anywhere from 1 to 2 years in length due to the service of the Queen Mary and her sister, the Queen Elizabeth. So this ship really affects the outcome of the war, saves many, many lives, obviously, and is a bona fide war hero. After the war, the Queen Mary helps to reunite families that had started during the war across the Atlantic. She then enjoys another 20 years of ocean liner service after the war and is active up until 1967 when jet air travel is coming into prevalence. The Cunard Line starting to lose their passengers to the airlines. They're losing that revenue and it just became too expensive to continue to operate the Queen Mary. So Cunard put the ship up for auction and it was the city of Long Beach here that offered the highest bid at $3,450,000. She then makes her final voyage to travel here to Long Beach. And it would typically take the Queen Mary about 5 days to travel from England, Southampton, England, to New York. It took her 39 days to get to Long Beach from Southampton. Does anybody have an idea why it might have taken so much longer? I think you have it, yes. the ship had to travel all the way around South America because at the time, the Panama Canal wasn't as wide as it is now, and so the Queen Mary was 8 feet too wide to fit through the Panama Canal, and so she had to go around South America and Cape Horn to get here. The Queen Mary has been in Long Beach ever since. That means she has spent 56 years here in Southern California and now has more years of history in Long Beach than she had out at sea before coming here. And so I'd just like to point out to all of you that you are here for a very significant period in the history of this ship, because just this past weekend we reopened after a shutdown of about 3 years, which is one of the longest stoppages of service of the Queen Mary since her maiden voyage. And so we're very excited to be back and operating again, and thank you for being a part of that, because we couldn't do it without you folks either. So thank you for that. All right, that's a basic history. Does anybody have any questions before I get into engineering? Yes, sir.
Are there a lot of ghosts on there?
So, are there a lot of ghosts aboard the Queen Mary? Yeah. No, I'm just messing with you. Different people have different opinions on that. We have had many reports of paranormal activity aboard the Queen Mary over the years, so there are many people who believe that this ship is haunted, but I will let you decide for yourself, okay? Yeah, me neither, but that's okay. Some people do though. Yes?
That was my question. Well,
yes?
Typically, how many knots you travel?
That's a great question. So he's asking about the speed of the Queen Mary. The Queen Mary could achieve speeds over 30 knots. Her average cruising speed when she was moving as an ocean liner, she would typically travel at about 28.5 knots. But in some of her speed trials, we hear reports where she got up to like 36, 37 knots. If you don't know what that means, she could travel at about 35 miles per hour. And I realize that might not sound all that fast if you're thinking about what you can do in a Ferrari or a Lamborghini, but consider they're way smaller and travel on land. When you're moving a ship the size of the Queen Mary across the ocean at 30 plus knots, it's incredibly fast. Yeah, so one thing I always like to point out is the torpedoes during World War II when the Queen Mary was hunted by German U-boats traveled at about 12 knots. So she could have theoretically or technically outrun a torpedo. Passenger ships don't go as fast as the Queen Mary did anymore. Now there are vessels that can go faster. I'm sure that there's military ships that can top out much higher. In fact, I used to work on the battleship New Jersey, one of the 4 Iowa-class battleships, just like she's a sister to the Iowa that we have in San Pedro over here. Those ships are all retired now, but they were built for the Second World War, and they list their top speed at 33 plus knots, and they still won't tell you how much plus. That's still classified, because military vessels don't want to brag about how fast they can go, just in case they need that classified. So, any other questions? All right, let's get into some of this engineering. First off, I'll just talk about the area we're in. We're at the bridge of the ship, or the wheelhouse. This is where they would pilot or steer the vessel. Now, the Queen Mary had a different sort of propulsion system from a lot of modern ships. So these cruise ships that are out here, they typically are powered with what we call propulsion pods. And so they'll have a propeller inside of a housing that can rotate about 360 degrees so they can get thrust in any direction they want. That allows for very precise movement and allows them to do things that older vessels like the Queen Mary could not do. I have watched these cruise ships pull out from the dock sideways and then do 360s there in the water because they're able to do that. Queen Mary couldn't do that. She had a fixed propulsion system, and so she had 4 screws or 4 propellers, and they were facing one direction. They didn't move around like this. And so you could get forward or you could reverse those propellers to slow and stop the ship. But to steer the ship, you used a rudder. The Queen Mary had a rudder, a single fin sticking into the water. Now, this was one of the largest rudders that had ever been put aboard a ship at the time. The Queen Mary's rudder was 3 stories tall and weighed 170 tons. So you can probably appreciate that it was a good thing they had some power steering assist to that steering mechanism. They used hydraulics to turn the rudder. But so that rudder is what was used to steer the ship. So the Queen Mary is big, she's beautiful, and she was fast. but she's not terribly nimble. She wasn't the most maneuverable vessel. But they would steer the ship with the wheel here. Now you may notice there are 3 wheels here at the bridge of the ship. These are redundant systems. These are backup systems to one another. I will be redundantly mentioning redundancies throughout this tour because you find them in every aspect of the ship. Obviously, it's very important to be able to do all the critical jobs that you need to do when you're out in the middle of the ocean and have thousands of lives in your care. And so if one wheel needs to be maintained or needs some repair work done to it, you have other wheels that you can use. In fact, not only are there 3 wheels here at the bridge of the ship, there are another 3 wheels, or there were another 3 wheels back at the aft end. And so there were actually 6 different wheels they could use to steer the Queen Mary. Now these wheels control the hydraulic systems to turn the rudder. This wheel is a little bit different from some of the others in that this wheel was connected to one of their navigation systems. If you look just over here, you can see this is a gyroscopic compass. And so inside here, there are these gyro motors that spin and create centrifugal force to be able to determine true north. And that allows them to navigate the ship. The gyroscopic compass was connected to this wheel. It's nicknamed an iron mic. And this was basically like an autopilot system. So this could set and hold a course. Now, it wasn't an autopilot and you could set it and then go to sleep and everything would be fine. It wasn't like that. But it could hold a course very effectively. Interestingly enough, they would only use this sparingly and rarely because the one thing that setting a course on the autopilot mechanism didn't account for was how the waves struck the ship. And when you're crossing the ocean, you want to take those waves as smoothly as possible because if they're pounding up against the hull, that's going to make the ride rougher. It's going to make it a lot less pleasant for the passengers and the crew, and could even cause some damage, some wear, and of course affect your fuel consumption and those areas as well. So it just made a lot more sense to have a human being manning the helm and making those slight adjustments so that they were taking those waves smoothly and efficiently. We mentioned the gyroscopic compass for navigation. They also used magnetic compasses. Inside this housing called a binnacle is a magnetic compass. Now, of course, you can probably recognize that there's quite a bit of metal in the construction of the Queen Mary. She's built of steel. There are many other metals here. Actually, one of the reasons you find so much brass at the bridge is because it doesn't interfere with those magnetic signals, but other metals could. And so next to all these magnetic compass housings, you'll see these iron spheres. They're called compensators, and these would be calibrated to keep this compass accurate and true so that you could trust your navigational readings. So we've talked about navigation and we've talked about steering. The last thing I want to talk about up here at the bridge is communication, because obviously if this is where the orders are coming from, you need to be able to clearly communicate those orders throughout the ship. And there were a number of ways they could do that. We see more redundancies. I'll start with the most simple and basic type of communication. That's this. This is a talking tube, and it is exactly that. It's a tube that goes to a nearby part of the ship. Have any of you ever gone to a playground and they have like a tube at the jungle gym and you call through it? Pretty cool, right? This is exactly the same thing. Now, of course, you couldn't talk to every area of the ship that way. Some of those parts are too far away and those areas get too noisy. But you could talk to nearby areas. So these talking tubes could help you to communicate with the docking wings on either side of the bridge here. We could talk to the signaling bridge right above us. They could call back to the ready room just behind us here at the bridge. And the captain's quarters were located just below the bridge here. So he was always nearby, even when he was asleep in his bed. And if they needed him, they could yell through this tube right here that went down to his quarters. But obviously that's a limited use for those talking tubes. If you look behind us at the back end of the bridge there you see a bank of telephones. Now I recognize that those telephones look a good deal different from the phone I carry around in my pocket all day, but that's what telephones kind of look like. And those are actually called loudophones. You might notice that there's a piece that covers your ear and covers your mouth. That's to help you be able to communicate in the engine rooms and some of those areas over the din of that machinery. Also, those loudophones are what they call sound powered, and so they were designed so that if there was an electrical issue or something, they'd still operate, they'd still be able to communicate. But interestingly enough, typically when they were sending orders from the bridge, especially to the engine rooms, they weren't using either of those communication systems, they were using these. These are called telegraphs. And I imagine that you've probably seen these if you've watched movies about ships, and we'll see people furiously operating these, and I think sometimes people think that's how they're actually manipulating the engines and the machinery. They're talking to one another using these devices. These are communications devices. And I'll explain how they work. I think I mentioned that the Queen Mary had 4 screws, 4 propellers. Each of those propellers has its own engine. So each one has its own propulsion drive, and these are talking to those different engines. So if you take a look here, you can see this is labeled port inner. So that's for the port side inner propeller. This is the port side outer propeller. This is starboard inner and starboard outer. So right here, one crew member could talk to all 4 of these engine rooms. Or, well, sorry, 2 engine rooms, 4 engines. Each engine room had 2 engines. Over on that side, that's a redundant system to this one. So it's the same thing over there where they can talk to all 4 of those engines and give orders specifically for each of them at that location. The way that these work is that there is a corresponding telegraph in each of the engine rooms to each of these. So down in the engine room, there'll be a telegraph for the port outer propeller like this. And let's say we're going to send orders down to that engine room. The first thing the officer up here would do would be to take this handle and move it back and forth. And that would ring a bell on the telegraph in the engine room to let them know that they had orders coming in. Then they would position the handle to the place for the orders that they are giving. So let's say we're going to full ahead steam. They put the handle in that position. That sends an electronic signal to the telegraph in the engine room and moves the arrow on that telegraph to that position to deliver the order. The engineer back there sees that, matches the arrow with his handle, and that moves the arrow up here at the bridge to let these officers know that those engineers have received their orders and are executing them. It's basically an electronic way for them to say, aye, aye, Captain, yes, sir, right? And what's nice about that is you can visually see what your status is. You know, if I've got this here and the arrow is still over there, get me on the telephone or something because they haven't received their or aren't acknowledging those orders. This telegraph is a little bit different. Sometimes people ask about this. I mentioned that there were 3 other wheels. We will see one of them and we'll see the corresponding telegraph up here because you'll see when we go back to aft steering, that wheel is below decks. And so you can't see where you're going. Now you can pilot the ship using your navigational equipment and communications. And this is the communications because up here they would tell them, okay, we're going to go to port or to starboard this many degrees. Any questions? Yes?
What is the static crew cabin for?
That was actually a navigational area. So when they were getting near to ports, when they could get radio information from the port itself about the harbors that they were either leaving from or entering into, they would go in there and plot the course. Because where it really gets specific with navigating a ship like this is when it's coming in and out of port. And oftentimes these ships will have what's called a harbor master come aboard who's somebody who knows those waters better than anybody. And so you might have a different, a captain who takes the ship all the way across the ocean, and then the harbor master will be there to give his expertise on coming into a particular port. But that was just an area where they could execute those navigational plotting without too much disturbance. Yeah. I don't think it was actually soundproof either. I think it was probably sound dampening, but yeah, proof, I'm skeptical, yeah. All right, we are gonna head down now to, we're gonna go back down the way we came, and then we're actually gonna step off the ship, head back to the aft end, and we're gonna take a look at the engine room area. So we're not going there on my tour. So after this tour, I know there was one other young man who wanted to know about building pirate ships. And so I think they were shooting like big battle scenes and stuff that they were probably doing the sound after.
Okay, got it.
Okay. Folks, please be very careful here. I'm just gonna have you go across, watch your step, please.
Okay. The catwalk, is that? Oh, yeah. The one in the. Oh, we're not going to the border. I'm not sure.
I
But,
bet you that wasn't on the ship before.
okay. Oh, between the. Yeah, I got you.
That's probably just the birds right up there eating stuff. Birds would eat barnacles.
I see. Okay. I'm at the lobby right now. I'm inside the lobby. I might use connection.
This is the boiler room.
It looks exactly the same, Alex. Yeah. I know we talked about it. Yeah.
Folks, we're gonna head on down here. And I'm just gonna have y'all take a spot along this railing here because we want to be able to have a good look at this cross section of the Queen Mary here. Yeah, she can carry all of this. She's big. All right, so I just wanted to have us take a look at this cross section of the ship because this will give us a good idea of how things are arranged. And I think also helps us really get an appreciation for some of the brilliance of the design and engineering of the ship and everything. First off, I'll just mention, if you're feeling maybe a little winded or tired because you've been walking, we've walked pretty far already. We were just up here at the bridge or the wheelhouse of the ship, and now we are, give me a second, back here. So we've traveled quite a bit of ways already, and then in a few minutes we're going to go down and take a look at the engine room, and we're even going to see one of the ship's propellers at the end of the tour. We've talked about the fact that the Queen Mary was one of the largest ocean liners ever built at that time. She's almost twice the size of what the Titanic was. Let me give you those specific numbers. The Queen Mary is 1,019.5 feet long from her bow back to her aft end. She is 185 feet tall from the keel up to the top of the stacks. She has 12 decks. She has a beam or width of 118 feet, and the Queen Mary is 81,237 gross tons. The Queen Mary was fueled by bunker C fuel oil, so she was not a coal-fired ship. A lot of times our guests, not surprisingly, are familiar with the Titanic. So we have some similarities in that both of these ships were steamships. But the Titanic was burning coal to heat up water to make steam to power her piston engines. And the Queen Mary was fueled by bunker C fuel oil to heat up water to make steam to power turbine engines. So her engines are like big fan blades. They look like a jet engine, and the steam hits those blades and gets those turbines spinning, and then those turn the reduction gears, the propeller shafts, and the 4 screws or the propellers that could move her through the water at the incredible speeds we talked about earlier, over 30 knots. That bunker C fuel oil that was used to burn, to make the steam, is very thick. It's a very viscous fuel. It's the resin that's left over after you have refined finer fuels, so it's like tar. They actually have to heat it just to get it to flow. They would store that fuel oil in the hull of the ship. So you see here what we call the double cellular bottom. That goes all the way around the ship, basically. So the Queen Mary had a double hull. She has one hull built inside of another. And in the space, the void between those two hulls, there were tanks for fuel and other ballast tanks as well. And this was brilliant because the Queen Mary had to carry quite a bit of fuel. She was going all the way across the ocean, so she couldn't, to make a stop along the way. And she was not terribly fuel efficient. She averaged about 13 feet per gallon. So if you ever find yourself looking at your own highway mileage on your vehicle and thinking it's not that great, just thank goodness you're not piloting the Queen Mary every day. So they would have to, it would take about 1.5 million gallons for one transatlantic crossing. And so it was really brilliant that they were storing that fuel in those voids in the hull of the ship, because they didn't have to have enormous fuel tanks taking up the space they wanted for the passengers and the cargo, and they could pump that fuel from the different sides and areas of the ship to adjust her balance in the water. That fuel oil would get burned in these 5 boiler rooms at the base of the ship to heat up water in 27 enormous boiler tanks there to create steam. The smoke from the burning of the fuel would get vented out the smokestacks. The steam would power turbo generators to make electricity for use aboard the Queen Mary, and the steam also powered the Queen Mary's turbine engines. Here in boiler room number 1, we had a different type of boiler from the other boilers in boiler rooms 2 through 5. There were 3 boilers in boiler room number 1, and they were what are called Scotch style boilers, or Scotch type boilers. These were big cylindrical shaped boilers, 17 feet in diameter. They were producing steam at 225 degrees Fahrenheit and 225 pounds of pressure per square inch. That steam was used to power the 5 turbo generators located here and here that generated the electricity for use aboard the ship. And the Queen Mary's power plant could generate up to 9,100 kilowatts of electricity, enough to power a city of about 100,000 people. The boilers in boiler rooms 2 through 5 were big cube-shaped boilers. They were 23 feet on each side, and those are called Yarrow tube style boilers. Those were generating steam at 700 degrees Fahrenheit, much hotter than 7 degrees, and 400 pounds of pressure per square inch. And so you can imagine those engineers had to be alert because those could be hazardous working conditions. Steam at that temperature and pressure could cut right through you. And so you really had to be on top of your professionalism and watch out for any dangers that could take place. Also, it would be difficult work conditions in there. These boiler room compartments were both watertight and airtight, and they would actually pressurize the boiler rooms. That was part of what was called a closed stokehold system. That increased air pressure fed the flames, or stoked the flames with oxygen so that they were burning the fuel oil more efficiently, but that could also, of course, create some discomfort for the crew. You would often feel like, you needed to pop your ears. And then the ambient temperatures in those boiler rooms would get up to 115 degrees Fahrenheit. So they worked in 4-hour shifts, so they weren't dropping like flies. They even had to wear wooden-soled shoes to work in the boiler rooms because rubber soles would have simply melted. One other thing I haven't mentioned yet is what a valuable resource the water was aboard the Queen Mary. Now, they could desalinate water. Here we see the water treatment facility, or the water softening plant. And so they could pull seawater into the sea chest, into the ship, and desalinate it. And that water could be used for the showers, the washing, even for drinking water. But the purest, cleanest water on the Queen Mary was carried in freshwater tanks, and that water was for the boilers. because when you heat up that water and convert it from a liquid to a vapor, any minerals or particulates could cause corrosion, could gunk up the machinery, and so that water was very pure and was such a valuable resource that after they converted that water into steam and used it to power the engines, they would then recycle that steam and use it again. And that system was efficient enough that they could recycle about 90% of that water. And so by the end of the voyage, they would be topping off those boilers with some desalinated water, but it was such a small percentage of it that it didn't cause any issues. So, I think that's everything I want to say. Yeah.
How thick was the hull?
The hull is super, okay. The hull of the ship is about just over an inch thick, about an inch, less than an inch and a half thick. Now, of course, there were 2 hulls, so you're getting maybe up to 3 inches of steel, and the void between, but not as thick as you might think.
I see the bottom says double bottom.
Yeah, so there, just like we talked about, so there was a space between those 2 hulls,
In
basically.
case something got breached in there.
Well, and there were tanks in there too, so they were using that for like storage of fluids. Yep. Yeah. Now that's pretty thick for steel. I mean, that's pretty thick. For me, I think my perspective on it's a little warped because the first ship I worked on was the New Jersey, was a battleship, and those Iowa-class battleships have hulls that are 16.5-inch thick armor-plated steel hulls. So to me, the Queen Mary's like, oh, that's really thin, but I don't know, an inch. I mean, that's a lot of steel, but yeah, I guess it's relative. All right, we're gonna head down to the engine room and have a look at engine room number 2. Okay.
Going down to the engine room now.
Okay. I get excited. So much information.
There's a fire still here. Oh, he just slapped the anchor.
This? Yeah, almost. That was funny. I gave this thing a high five, and this kid was like, I want to high five it, and her mom was like, don't you dare. And I'm like, she can do whatever she wants. She's not gonna hurt this. I mean, don't hurt yourself, but. This is one of the Queen Mary's anchors. This is the real thing. 2 of them are still hanging from the bow, and this is a spare, an auxiliary anchor. Each one of these anchors weighs 16 tons. They would have had 990 foot of chain attached to each anchor. Every link in that chain weighs 225 pounds. So maybe you can help me pull this out of here.
Venturing to the depths below. Oh, there's like water lights down there.
I just want to bring us out as we're heading down to the engine room here. That these walkways that we are using are not original. These were installed to make it convenient for tourists like us to be able to get through these spaces. But as we go through, if you look off to the sides in some of these areas, you'll see some of the original catwalks and ladders. That gives you a much clearer idea of what the conditions were like for the crew that were actually working here in these areas of the ship. So we are in engine room number 2. There were originally 2 of these engine rooms. And I was just like to point that out, because as you look around this room, as massive and impressive as all this machinery is, just remember that we're only seeing half of the engines that use to power the ship. We are in the engine room that powered the 2 inner propellers, inboard propellers aboard the Queen Mary. The engine room that powered the outer propellers was originally located from us here. But basically, if you were to draw a line down the center line of this compartment, we have one engine for each of the propellers on either side, and they are mirroring one another, so they are identical. The Queen Mary has, quadruple expansion engines. And what that means is that each one of her engines has 4 turbines activating, being powered by that steam. And we can actually follow that path here. So if you look at the forward end of the compartment there, you see those 2 big pipes labeled high pressure head steam. If you look on the starboard side over here, you can follow that pipe back. And then if you look right over there, you can see it's labeled high pressure head steam there. So it goes back to there. That's where the steam being generated in the boiler rooms, that 700 degree, 400 pounds per pressure steam was coming into the engine room. And then we can follow the path. If you go all the way back there, you'll see that the steam begins in the high pressure head turbine housing and then moves on to the first intermediate pressure turbine housing. Right? Then to the second intermediate pressure turbine housing, and finally to the low pressure turbine housing. And as the steam is going, coming into contact with those turbines, it's getting those blades moving and gets those turbines spinning at very high revolutions per minute, over 1,000 RPMs. After the steam has gone through all 4 turbines and they've drawn all the power from it that they can, then they would recycle that steam, like we talked about earlier. So then the steam is going to these condenser units on either side of the system. Inside of those housings, there are thousands of metal tubes where they would pull up ocean water into sea chests and pump that freezing cold ocean water through those tubes so that when the steam comes into contact with the cold tubes, it cools it down enough to recondense it back to water. That water is then recycled back to the boilers to make steam all over again. So very efficient system there. Also, brilliantly, the seawater that they would use, once that seawater is contacted by the steam, that cold water gets warmed up through that process. They would then take that now warmer seawater and use that to fill up the swimming pools and bathtubs like that, so it wasn't still freezing cold fresh out of the ocean. Yeah. As we head down here, you'll notice over on this side, you'll see a pipe labeled reversing steam. When they wanted to bring the Queen Mary to a stop or slow her down, they would stop the forward engines and then they could engage reversing steam, and that would turn the propellers in the opposite direction. Of course, given the size and the speed of the Queen Mary and her momentum, it would take over about 10 miles to bring the Queen Mary to a stop. Yeah, you had to really think ahead.
Somebody fell overboard.
Yeah, you were.
It's gonna take a while.
Nope. I mean, honestly, seriously, if you were out in the middle of the ocean and fell off Queen Mary when she was steaming at 20, 27, 25 and a half knots, whatever,
Even if they wanted to stop.
you're gone. Do you know about the Curacao? During the Second World War, the Queen Mary had a terrible collision where she collided with another British ship and sank. And over 300 servicemen were killed in that accident. The Queen Mary kept right on going. One, because of 1,000 servicemen aboard the ship that they couldn't risk putting all those lives in danger. But secondly, just because it would have been pointless. Because by the time they could stop the ship and try to rescue people, they would probably be gone already.
So how did they miss them? I'm sorry. What is that?
Our service.
British service people. Yeah.
How did the boat?
She was a British ship, so they kind of felt bad about
They
it.
felt bad.
Yeah, they did.
Couldn't they see the other ship? I mean, how did
Yeah, there's a whole thing that goes into that, but the Queen Mary would execute serpentine maneuvers. She was preemptively taking evasive maneuvers in case, unbeknownst to them, there was a submarine trying to target them. So she would just zigzag all the way. And there was an incident where she pulled one of those maneuvers and an escort ship crossed her path, and to fatal consequences. So we are now at the control panel or starting platform for this engine room. This is kind of the nerve center for the engine room here. And here we can see some of the partners to the telegraphs we looked at the bridge earlier. This is one of those telegraphs. And so this is where they would be seeing those orders coming in from the bridge and responding to let them know that they had received those orders. And then the engineers would start turning these wheels. And these are the wheels that they would use to actually open and close valves to control the flow of steam and control these engines. We see some of the redundant systems here. Here we have a loudophone. This telegraph communicates to the boiler rooms that were providing steam to this engine room, so that they could give them information. They could let them know if they needed to adjust their flow of fuel or oxygenation, to burn that fuel at peak efficiency. It's pretty amazing when you look at this engine room, the size of it and all the machinery in here, and realize that this area of the ship could be crewed by about 5 engineers at a time. Which really, I think, illustrates that these were real professionals. They had to know everything. You really had to be able to manage a lot. Now, of course, that doesn't mean 5 people could run the ship by themselves. This is one engine room. There were 2 of those, 2 turbo generator rooms, 5 boiler rooms, the crew at the bridge of the ship. So you're probably looking at a crew of closer to 60 or more. I remember seeing some movie where, like a half dozen guys hijacked a battleship or something and started driving it around, and I was like, I don't think that would work. I don't think you could really do that, but it is pretty amazing to think that 5 people could operate this area right here. All right, I'm gonna climb over here. Yeah, I'm gonna come out right here. Okay.
Watch out, Nick.
Yeah, I just don't want to step on anybody. Don't try this at home, okay? All right, we're gonna go take a look at the reduction gears.
Mama's coming down.
All right.
You're probably smelling fuel oil. Oh yeah.
Still from leftover, the smell.
Oh yeah.
It must be really strong peppers.
Yeah, they will burn in those fuel oil in the firehouse. Yeah, fuel, they will burn in fuels and they heat up water to make steam. It's just like on a locomotive, you see those old fire locomotives. Same principle, make steam except we're just burning a different fuel source. Yeah, and it wasn't, they weren't using those types of engines at that time. It was really still, you were getting your most power from steam engines. Now, electric. All right, so we are now between the reduction gears. They have removed the steel covers and replaced them with plexiglass over here so we can have a look into this gear housing to get an idea of what's going on in there. But it's a little bit deceiving because we can only see such a small part of it. So let me just try to explain. On the top, what you're seeing is part of an enormous gear. That gear is 14 feet in diameter. And so it's hard to imagine because it doesn't look like it in here, but that gear is huge. It's more than twice the height of a person. And connected to it, that you can see on the bottom here, there are 4 gears coming from the turbines. So basically, each of those 4 turbines in the engine is connected to a gearing system connecting to one of these 4 gears that attaches to that big 14-foot diameter gear. And so they're taking those varying speeds of revolutions per minute, over 1,000 revolutions per minute, and converting that to about 172 revolutions per minute. But through that process, they're slowing the speed down and increasing the force, the torque, or the power of it. And that is allowing that 14-foot gear to get the power it needs to turn the propeller shafts and the propellers themselves. Yes? I have no idea. Maybe a ghost? I don't know. Or maybe, somebody got on somebody's shoe and fell off during a tour. I don't know. Could be. I think you're right, though. I think it might be a leaf. Looks kind of goofy. So we are gonna actually head back out of here the way that we came in and see a couple other spots. But I'm gonna offer you an opportunity if you want to. You can take a peek up in here because you can look up inside of that turbine housing. And if you look off to your left up there, you can actually see the turbine in there. So you can see all those blades that the steam would be striking to get that turning. And then once you're done, you can go ahead and head back towards Tim.
Visible.
I'm I mean, I think some of those guys were, wired to love it.
Yeah.
Like I've talked to some of those engineers, and they'd be like, "Oh, I found the humming of the engine to be so, soothing or whatever, Luckily, we're all a little wired differently, so that's a student of
Can't go back over there, can we?
Not right now. Sorry.
It's mostly just because we're not able, they don't want us to take our groups
I see.
through. It's more about the walking than anything else. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I think it's the narrow escalator.
Yeah, but because those areas used to be open before. It's kind of,
I know. Believe me, I understand.
That's really strange.
Oh. Part of it though is that we're still, like right now, part of the reason we're on limited tours and it's only tour access is we have to have our guests off by 6 o'clock. So I think some of that access will broaden, as we get cleared.
I see. Okay.
So we're really, we're really, still in our soft opening kind of.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense.
We're gonna get more access. And more
Gotcha. That's good to know.
Yeah. Yeah, it's gonna get even better.
Okay. Also, I was wondering what's behind here.
Behind here?
Yeah.
It's let me. Yeah, check.
Okay.
I mean, it's actually what it is now is an exhibit. It's the Churchill exhibit. You can actually hear this.
That's what it is. Okay.
So you can actually
I've been back
see
there.
through that window into like that briefing room that's in the Churchill exhibit.
I see. Okay, gotcha.
Yep. So it's like right over there. You'll see the staircase.
Yes. Gotcha.
That's what that is. Yeah.
And do you know where the other engine room used to be?
Yeah. It used to be forward.
Oh, right here. So basically here-ish. Oh, okay. Well, thank you.
I mean, this one. So like when you look in here, I don't know if this door is open here.
I can film this, right? This is okay.
Yeah, you can't really see. So like you see some of those valves though. That's the engine room we were just in. So then forward of that was where the engine room number 1 was.
I see. All right, thank you.
All right, folks, we're gonna head
Alex,
over
you
this way.
I'm back.
A lot of famous people would come on the boat because they would take
I was
the boat
just
to
kidding
different
the whole time, waiting for
places in Europe because that was how you traveled back then.
I mean, they're a lot smaller.
Wait, so you're just sitting here all the time?
They push it.
Lots more. Even every ship
I see.
built since then.
But they were probably different ones.
Safety measures because of
Different kinds of.
Okay.
Go sighting.
Oh yeah, we got lots of those ships. Hey folks, I just noticed I'm already at an hour, so I don't want to mess up anybody else's timetables or anything if you have a tight schedule. I've got like 2 more places I would like to show you though. So if you are willing and interested, stick with me. If not, I guess let Tim know. Not to dump it on you, Tim, but here, we're gonna head this way.
You guys want to see a couple
I talk
words?
too much.
Luke, stay with us, buddy, okay?
This is the hardest one because we go so far.
Looking in the painting that'd be right over my top.
You'd probably still be able to take the walkways off of the ship. And just, what would probably happen is be messed up is when they lean to one side or the other.
How many ships do you know here at that?
Yeah, that's not original. Nope. Interestingly, though, unfortunately, I can't take any of this spot right now. But where we just were, what we just walked around, there's a watertight door there. Have you heard about hatch door number 13?
No. Is that why 13th the unlucky?
It's not. There's another story about why 13 is an unlucky number, and it actually has to do with the Knights Templar. The Knights Templar, many of them were murdered on the 13th of whenever that was, but it was Friday the 13th, and that's where that bad luck
So
originates.
the door 13 is something different.
Yes, door 13. Wait, there was one other.
Did somebody get like trapped behind the door?
Who? Oh, it was you, right? You wanted to hear ghost stories too? All right. When we get out of here, I'll tell both. You guys come to me and I'll tell you a little bit about door 13. All right. So we are now in aft steering, and we talked about this when we were up at the bridge. You want to steer the ship? You can. It's okay with me. This is the telegraph that we saw up at the bridge that's telling us how to steer when we're steering down here. Just be careful, don't hit your head, because all this stuff is real hard. So this is another one of those wheels that could be used to pilot the ship. And you can see they have their compass, their communication systems. And this was another one that would control hydraulics to turn the rudder. In fact, that's what most of the machinery we see here is. These are the electric motors operating those hydraulic pumps that would pump the hydraulic fluid to turn the rudder of the ship. And then initially there was another wheel that was mounted on this pedestal here, and this was a much larger wheel because it had to be. Because this was a redundant system in case your hydraulics weren't working properly and you needed to manually turn that rudder. And so this wheel had to be big because you had to be able to fit 3 or 4 crew members on it at the same time for the extra muscle. Luckily, they kept this well enough maintained that that never needed to be used. The only time they ever would have actually used this system would have been in sea trials, at times when they were testing the system to make sure that it would work in an emergency, but it never came to that. When we go back here, you're going to see the 2 big hydraulic cylinders. Those are the cylinders for the hydraulic fluids, and then in between them you can see a sign that labels the rudder head, the top of the rudder.
There's more of the tubes, right?
These, I think, actually were part of this. Yeah. Well, some would and some would. It depends what they were moving. Like those, probably not. Yeah, you can even see too. They've unhooked. Like this is some of that linkage. So this
is stuff that's moving. This is like
yeah.
a dangerous place.
Yeah. Yeah, you have to keep your head on a swivel.
Oh yeah, sure. Not just one that goes up from this area.
Well, I mean, honestly, I think it's remarkable that we do know some accidents that took place over the years, but surprisingly few, and I think it shows us right past it, but right now they haven't cleared us to walk through that.
Is it because it's too haunting?
Would that be cool if that was why? Oh, okay. Well then no, it isn't. I was gonna lie to you and say yes, that's why, but no. No, it's because because safety inspectors take their job seriously and took a look at that and they said, hey, let's wait till we have more clearance, more assurance, more permits, that kind of thing going. All right, we're about to take a look at the ship's propeller because, of course, everything that we have talked about on this tour leads us to the propellers, right? We burn fuel oil to heat up water, to make steam, to power engines, to turn propellers. A couple things I wanted to point out before we go have a look at this propeller. First off, when we step through this opening here, we are stepping off of the Queen Mary. So I am touching the outside hull of the ship here. They built this room, this box, this freshwater tank onto the side of the ship after she came here to Long Beach. So I just like to explain that because sometimes people will look in here and they'll be like, the propeller's in a box, how did that work? It didn't used to be, it just is now, so we can look at it. Also, just to help you get an idea of the size of these propellers, this is 18 feet across from tip to tip and weighs 32 tons. But we're told that they were so perfectly balanced that when the Queen Mary was in a dry dock, when she was sitting out in the water, they say that you could walk up to the propellers and spin them with your bare hand because of how perfect the balance was. The propeller is underwater, so it can be a little difficult to get an accurate gauge on the size. If you look over there, you'll see that cap sitting on the deck. That's a propeller cap. And when we go in here, you'll see another one that's still attached to the propeller. Sitting next to the cap there on the deck, that's the nut that holds that cap in place. And when we enter here, you can see the propeller itself.
Is it underwater so it doesn't erode? Or?
I think most of it will. Because it looks neat. I think. Well, and they used to have a little motor attached to it, so it would turn slowly. So I think they just thought that would look cool in the water. A lot of people remember we talked about the collision with the other ship. So a lot of people talk about the idea that it's all different from off. And so it would not be hard to imagine some of those potentially, or just drowned by suction. Like split it completely. Queen Mary had the bow dented, which she right on the nose, and she did. It's funny you say that because when I was 17, I rear-ended my friend's Toyota. No, he had a Honda Civic, and I was driving a 1979 Toyota Sabre. I totaled his car, and then loaded all of them up in my car and drove them all home. Because my car was fine. Yeah, no, my car was fine. He had a scrape on the wall. I'm serious, it did nothing to that car. Yeah, so here we can see the propeller. Also, just take an opportunity here, you get a good look at the hull of the ship. So you can really see how that hull is constructed of overlapping steel plates that are riveted together. She's not welded together, she's riveted. There are more than 10 million rivets in the construction. Yeah. You were joking. Guess what? You were right. I don't want to insult you, but your joke isn't funny because it's accurate. It's absolutely correct. Yeah. Not that you're not funny, but yeah, it's that ridiculous, isn't it? It's super cool. Yeah.
Oh, it's so big, wrench.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's one big beer.
Yeah, after you build a ship like this, you need a big beer after, and this is the chuck key for that. No, just in case any of you took a look at the nut over there and thought to yourselves, how on earth do you turn a nut that size? You just need the right tool for the job. This is the wrench. And the way they would use this wrench, the nut would get positioned on the screw, on the bolt. The wrench would get lifted onto the nut using a crane or a winch or a block and tackle system. And then you notice how it's kind of beat up in this area of the wrench? That's because to turn a wrench like this, you pick up a big old sledgehammer and you hit it.
Oh, so that's how they do it.
That's how they do it.
Can I say something?
Yes. What is it?
How do you start that thing?
The propeller that we just saw? Is that what you're talking about? Well, you would have to do all the things we just talked about. And actually, it took a while. It would take more than 4 hours to get the engines warmed up before the Queen Mary was ready to head on a voyage. But they'd have to start burning that oil and making that steam and powering those turbines to get those turning. So it was a big process. The whole thing we've been talking about.
Wow. I have so much yellow.
Here's haunted parts all over.
So, hey, you gotta do all the stuff that we already talked about.
But back before we shut down, we had 345 hotel rooms. And those are the original suites and staterooms that passengers traveled in when she was an ocean liner.
So is it the first class ones or all?
Yeah. What we still have were primarily first and second class rooms.
And so would it stay full?
Welcome back.
We were kind of, I mean, who knows, like things are going to be different going forward maybe, but we are most likely like an event venue. So like when there are big things going on in the city, different things. When we have cruise ships heading out from behind us here, a lot of times we'll get their guests here the night before, maybe conventions, all kinds of stuff like that. And then events on the ship. You know, we host a lot of events like every year they would do a Scottish festival because the ship was built in Scotland, and so you know they'd have Highland games and bagpipes and all kinds of stuff. And so a lot of times we'd fill up on those. Sorry, I stopped on you. So, folks, I just want to let you know, we're going to walk you back now, back over to the elevators and back to where we started the tour from. But I want to just take an opportunity to thank you all for coming to visit the Queen Mary, and thank you for taking the tour. If you still have any questions or want to talk to me or Tim about anything, please do. Please let us help you if we can, and we'll be with you. We're going to take you back over this way. But again, I just want to say thank you. Thank you so much for being here.